The couple had been driving for hours through the winding countryside roads, their car meandering through endless fields and dense clusters of trees. It was Christmas Eve, and they were on their way to visit family, but a wrong turn had sent them down an unfamiliar route. The GPS had lost its signal, leaving them navigating blindly through the desolate landscape. As dusk descended, so did a sense of unease. When they saw the steeple rising in the distance, it felt like a strange beacon amidst the isolation, a sign of civilization, perhaps. The church seemed out of place, its white paint untouched by time, standing pristine against the gloomy sky. There were no other buildings in sight, no nearby roads or paths to suggest anyone still used it. Yet the sight of it felt oddly comforting after miles of emptiness. "We should check it out," the woman suggested, her voice breaking the tense silence. "Maybe someone inside can point us in the right direction." The man hesitated, but nodded. They parked the car on the gravel road and approached on foot. The air grew colder as they neared, their breath forming visible clouds. The wooden doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. It was almost as if the building was inviting them inside. The interior was immaculate. Rows of polished wooden pews stretched toward a grand altar adorned with fresh white lilies. Stained glass windows depicting angels and saints cast fragmented colors across the floor. A large wooden cross hung above the altar, its surface gleaming as though freshly polished. Everything about the church seemed frozen in time, untouched by the decay that should have come with age and abandonment. "This place is perfect," the man murmured, though the words felt wrong even as he spoke them. But as they stood in the nave, taking in their surroundings, a faint sound began to rise, a soft, low chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was faint at first, almost like the whisper of the wind, but it grew steadily louder, filling the cavernous space with an eerie resonance. "Did you hear that?" the woman asked, clutching his arm. The man nodded, his unease deepening. "Let's go." They turned to leave, but the doors they had entered through were now shut. Not just closed, sealed, as if they had never been open. The heavy oak didn't budge when they pushed and pulled, their efforts growing more frantic as the chanting grew louder, now layered with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through their bones. Turning back toward the nave, they froze. The pews were no longer empty. Shadowy figures were taking shape, their forms gradually solidifying as though emerging from the very air. Robed and faceless, they sat motionless, their attention fixed solely on the couple. "Who are they?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer, his eyes locked on the figures. One of them rose, moving with an unsettling smoothness. It gestured toward the altar, its hand long and skeletal. The chanting intensified, echoing off the walls like the cries of unseen spirits. The couple found themselves drawn forward against their will, their feet moving as if guided by an invisible force. Before the altar stood a massive, ancient book, its pages yellowed and inked with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at. The figure gestured for them to kneel. When they hesitated, the room seemed to shift. The air thickened, pressing down on them, and the walls trembled. The congregation stood as one, their presence an overwhelming weight that left the couple gasping for breath. They knelt. The robed figure opened the book, its long, bony fingers flipping the pages with deliberate precision. The chanting reached a fever pitch as the figure began reciting words in a guttural, otherworldly language. The stained glass windows dimmed, their vibrant colors bleeding into shadows, and the lilies on the altar withered, their petals falling like ash. Pain shot through the couple as a burning sensation spread through their bodies, starting at their foreheads and working its way down. The woman screamed, her hands clawing at her skin, while the man gritted his teeth, his vision blurring. The congregation moved closer, encircling them. Their forms were now almost fully solidified, their faces emerging beneath their hoods, distorted and cruel, with hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through their very souls. The figure at the altar reached out, placing a hand on each of their foreheads. A surge of cold swept through them, and their vision went dark. Images flashed in their minds, endless fields, darkened skies, and the church, forever pristine and waiting for its next visitors. The final image was of themselves, kneeling at the altar, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. When they awoke, the church was silent. The congregation was gone, and the air was still. The doors were open. They stumbled outside, their hearts pounding, and climbed into their car. Without a word, the man started the engine and sped away, gravel spraying behind them. They drove in silence, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. But as they drove, the scenery didn't change. The same fields, the same trees, the same winding road stretched endlessly before them. And then they saw it. The steeple rising in the distance, the pristine white paint glinting in the moonlight. The church was waiting, its doors open once again. The rain hammered against the windshield as Michael navigated the winding back road. The clock on his dashboard glowed 11:42 p.m. It was a route he had driven dozens of times before, the perfect shortcut to avoid the long detour through the highway. But tonight, the road felt different. The dense forest pressed in on either side, the trees clawing at the night sky like skeletal hands. His headlights struggled against the inky blackness, their beams swallowed almost entirely by the storm. Rounding a sharp bend, Michael slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching on the slick asphalt, and came to a halt just in front of a crumbling ancient bridge. A faintly glowing sign loomed beside it. Toll Bridge. Stop and pay. He frowned. He had never seen this bridge before. An eerie toll booth squatted at the bridge's entrance. Its warped wood was blackened with rot, and an old lantern swayed in the wind, casting erratic shadows. Inside stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, his sunken eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. Michael rolled down his window reluctantly, rain splashing onto his arm. "Evening," he called out, trying to mask his unease. "What's the toll?" The man's head tilted unnaturally, his grin revealing teeth that looked more like shards of bone. "Payment is required to cross," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. Michael patted his pockets. "Sorry, I don't have any cash on me." The toll keeper's grin widened, and his hand, bony and elongated, rested on the edge of the booth. "No payment, no crossing, but beware. Cross without paying, and the bridge will collect its toll another way." Annoyed, Michael waved him off. "Yeah, right." He reversed, swerved around the booth, and sped onto the bridge. As his car rumbled across the warped planks, he couldn't resist a glance in the rearview mirror. The toll keeper stood in the rain, watching him, his glowing eyes unblinking. By the time Michael reached the other side, the unsettling encounter had already begun to fade from his mind. He dismissed it as a local prank. It wasn't until he pulled into his driveway that he noticed the long, jagged scratches running along the side of his car, scratches that hadn't been there before. The following day, Michael found himself inexplicably drawn back to the bridge. He had no reason to take that route, but every road seemed to lead him there. His GPS malfunctioned, endlessly recalculating. Road signs twisted in unnatural directions, pointing him back toward the toll bridge. When he arrived, the toll keeper was waiting. "Pay the toll," the man demanded. This time, Michael handed over a $20 bill without argument, his hand trembling. The toll keeper took the money, his grin razor-sharp. "Your payment is accepted, for now," he hissed. As Michael drove forward, the bridge stretched impossibly long. The planks beneath his car groaned, bending as though about to snap. The lanterns lining the bridge flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move independently. The further he drove, the darker it became, until his headlights illuminated nothing but an endless void. Panic set in. He floored the accelerator, but the car's engine sputtered and died. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of the bridge and the distant sound of water rushing below. Michael stepped out, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The toll keeper stood at the far end of the bridge, though Michael hadn't seen him move. His grin stretched wider than ever, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The toll is not money. The toll is blood." Michael backed away, but the bridge seemed to shift beneath him, the planks warping and twisting as though alive. Shadows rose from the void, clawing at his legs. He screamed, but the toll keeper's laughter drowned him out. The last thing Michael saw was the toll keeper's glowing eyes, closer than they should have been, before he was dragged into the darkness. The next morning, Michael woke in his bed, gasping for air. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, until he saw the scratches on his arms, mirroring the marks on his car. Weeks passed, and Michael tried to return to his normal life. But every time he glanced at a reflective surface, he saw the toll keeper's face staring back at him. His glowing eyes, his jagged grin, always watching, always waiting. One night, Michael heard the unmistakable sound of his car engine roaring to life in the driveway. He rushed to the window, but no one was there. The car sat in the shadows, its headlights glowing faintly. The toll keeper's voice echoed in his ears. "You didn't pay enough." From that night on, every road Michael took led him back to the bridge. Each time, the toll grew steeper, and each time the toll keeper's grin widened, knowing Michael could never escape. For Michael, the bridge was no longer a shortcut. It was a trap, and he was its prisoner. It had been a grueling day on the road, and the couple, Jenna and Mark, were exhausted. The interstate stretched endlessly, with nothing but darkness and the occasional distant glow of a farmhouse to break the monotony. When they saw the flickering neon sign for the Restful Pines Motel, they both sighed in relief. "Finally," Mark muttered, turning into the gravel driveway. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles that looked like they hadn't moved in years. The motel itself was small and unremarkable, a single-story building with a faded, peeling sign that promised comfort and rest for all travelers. The vacancy light buzzed, casting an eerie green hue over the front office. Inside, a thin, pale man with sunken eyes and a hollow smile greeted them. His name tag read Edgar. "Just passing through?" Edgar asked in a voice that felt too quiet for the space. "Yeah," Mark replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just need a place to sleep for the night." Edgar slid a rusty key across the counter. "Room 7. Enjoy your stay." The room wasn't much. Beige wallpaper peeling at the corners, a bed with a sagging mattress, and the faint smell of mildew. A faded painting of a forest hung crookedly above the headboard. Jenna wrinkled her nose but said nothing. They were too tired to care. The couple fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the sound of wind whistling through the thin walls. Jenna woke first. The light creeping through the curtains was dim, weaker than it should have been. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. She nudged Mark awake. "Something feels off," she whispered. Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Probably just a bad night's sleep. Let's get out of here." But when they opened the door to leave, they were met not by the parking lot, but by the same hallway they had walked down the night before. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, stepping back inside. They tried again, walking the length of the hallway, but every door they opened brought them back to their room. The numbers on the doors seemed to shift as they moved, the 7 on their room flickering like an unstable image on an old TV. By mid-morning, panic had set in. Mark tried the windows, but when he broke the glass with a chair, he didn't see the parking lot or the woods beyond. Instead, there was only darkness, a deep, endless void that seemed to hum faintly, like a distant, menacing whisper. Jenna tried the phone. It rang twice before a voice answered. "You can't leave," it said, distorted and hollow. "Who is this?" she screamed. "Payment is due," the voice replied, and then the line went dead. Desperation drove them to explore further. At the end of the hallway, they found a door labeled Staff Only. They forced it open and stepped into a cavernous room filled with rows of identical keys, each dangling from a pegboard. A dusty ledger lay open on a nearby desk, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were chilling. Each listed a name, a date, and a cryptic note: checked in, prolonged stay, absorbed. Mark's hand trembled as he flipped to the last page. Their names were already written there, with today's date. "What does it mean by absorbed?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Mark could respond, the lights flickered, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the space. The walls seemed to ripple, the room stretching and twisting as though the motel itself were alive. They ran, weaving through endless corridors that shouldn't have existed in a single-story building. The hallways stretched infinitely, doors multiplying and shifting. The wallpaper began to rot and peel, revealing something dark and pulsating underneath. Each turn brought them back to their room. The walls seemed closer now, pressing inward. The air grew thick, and the guttural sound became deafening. Mark grabbed Jenna's hand, desperation in his eyes. "We can't stay here, we have to fight it." But before they could make another move, the door to their room swung open, revealing an abyss of writhing shadows. Tendrils of darkness snaked out, wrapping around their ankles and pulling them inside. The next morning, the Restful Pines Motel sat quietly under a gray sky. Edgar stood at the front desk, humming softly as he polished the counter. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting its eerie green glow. A minivan pulled into the parking lot, its occupants road-weary and eager for rest. A family of 4 stepped into the office, their faces bright with relief. "Just passing through?" Edgar asked, sliding a rusty key across the counter.